If you understand the situation in Kupyansk, you would know that the Russians are not having a fantastic time. And when I say they're not having a fantastic time, I mean the Russians that are left in Kupyansk are cold, they are hungry, and they are cut off from support. While there are a possibility to do supply drops through drones, and I'm sure that while the only thing they are more of than hungry is thirsty, dropping any supply drop and having somebody come out of a basement is a risk to their life and is a risk of showing where they are. And they're hiding in basements in the location that they're still in Kupyansk in order to survive, because the area is swarming with drones, Ukrainian and Russian, but being cut off and surrounded and having much of the city now controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces puts you in a situation where it's either go and get the resupply and don't starve, but then risk getting hit by the drone and bringing the drones back to you, or stay underground and starve. And then that brings its own problems. And the longer you starve until you eventually make the decision to go out, you'll be weaker, you'll be slower, and you won't have as much strength. And that it'll whittle down the Russians eventually until they either die by Ukrainian, infantry clearing them out, or drones doing the dirty work, or they surrender. The only other option is the Russians breaking them out. But for the time being, as the situation stands, the Russians don't have the forces in place to break them out. They are, in the area. They are attempting to fight against the Ukrainians in this area to see what they can do. But there, as far as we can see from this point, is no immediate breakthrough from the Russians back into Kupyansk that will give these men relief. So all likelihood points towards, as we can see here, as the Ukrainians are clearing more and more of Kupyansk itself out, all likelihood points towards the Ukrainians eventually controlling Kupyansk again, all of Kupyansk again, within the immediate future, and the Russians largely being pushed over the Oskil River until they can either dedicate more forces to the Kupyansk direction, to the Kupyansk axis, to either try the same thing that already failed again, or try a new approach, try to push more on the other side of the Oskil River, to try to make the approaches that they have failed to successfully clear enough ground through these fields in order to get to Kupyansk. Because the thing is, they have been making successes across these fields, but all these successes cost lives. It takes a long time. And even if you do, all you're going to do is get up to the Oskil River, and then you're going to have to deal with that embankment eventually anyway. And so the Russians thought maybe just, get over the Oskil River, deal with the logistical hurdle, deal with that issue now. And obviously it did not end up going too well in the city of Kupyansk for them. So maybe they'll redouble their efforts from the east. Maybe they'll redouble their efforts in other directions and take a back seat on this area and just try to slowly wear them down or stretch out Ukrainian forces. Maybe they will try the same thing again, or just try to press in other directions. But as we stand right now, the Russians in Kupyansk are in a very, very bad place, and the Russians outside of Kupyansk are not breaking them out. Now, maybe that'll change with movement in other directions, bringing more forces. But the problem with that and the likelihood of a Russian breakout is their forces are preoccupied in every other direction. On the Pokrovsk front, the Ukrainians are still showing presence in the north of the city. The city that the Russians have announced they have captured many times, and Solenyov was doing the propaganda tour inside the city. They still don't control all of it. Mirorod, even less so, and the gap between them, the Ukrainians were showing their presence just the other day. Just yesterday, they were trying to show their presence in the area.
Immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Thank you very much. And with the Russians announcing Pokrovsk to be this integral city for the struggle over the Donetsk region, even though the logistical support Pokrovsk could have provided as a railway hub, all of this has been smashed to bits through time, through fighting. It's still a big propaganda PR victory if they capture it, and obviously there are settlements behind it that would clear up the way for an advance into the north. That means Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk. These are directions that they could focus on instead of this part of. I mean, it is northern Donetsk, but it's more northern to mid Donetsk region. So this is an area they still want to take over for diplomatic reasons on the negotiating table. This is an area they want to take over for some tactical and strategic reasons. They want to conquer the rest of the Donetsk region, but they have an imminency about it because of how negotiations are going and how they want to present for the Trump administration. So they continue to engage in these infantry assaults that while they sustain heavy casualties, as we can see, these Ukrainian drone attacks in the city are engaging in casualties, they still want to capture that. They still want it imminently, even though, with time, they could probably capture it with maybe even less casualties if they took their time. They want it now for that diplomatic impact. And so they want to continue to fuel that push. They also want to continue to fuel the push in Hulipole because in Hulipole's case, there is a real immediate strategic usefulness to capturing Hulipole. Capturing Hulipole opens up the passageway to other locations that have been of strategic significance to the Ukrainians and are still of strategic significance to the Ukrainians. And not to say that Pokrovsk isn't of no significance, but to say that Orihiv has been smashed to bits would not be accurate. To say that there's no logistical use of Orihiv anymore would not be accurate. Orihiv was the central point, the launch point for the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. And I could definitely see in the eyes of the Russians that capturing that launch point for the 2023 counteroffensive in their mind could help secure their gains in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, which obviously the Ukrainians want to see the Russians out of. And the Russians want to push the Ukrainians out of the rest of the Zaporizhzhia region. Even if the negotiations right now are focusing on the Donetsk region, the Russians have still not said they're going to give up the Zaporizhzhia region. They're going to give up the Kherson region. As far as the Russian constitution is concerned, and as far as rhetoric from the presidential office from Putin is concerned, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson are Russian regions. And so taking out this launch point for the counteroffensive, as well as, and we filmed a bit in Orihiv during the 2023 counteroffensive, during the tail end of it with artillery teams and such, if they capture this, not only are they taking that launch point, they're capturing more of the Zaporizhzhia region, and they're opening up the pathway most dangerously to Zaporizhzhia. They would be able to flank the Ukrainian defensives in Orihiv, which have been mostly set to deal with attacks from the south. If they capture Hulipole, they would have the possibility of coming from at Orihiv, not only from the east and from the side here, which they've been trying to defend from a bit, but from behind, from the villages that you go to in order to get into Orihiv. If I was to go into Orihiv now, I would probably use either this pathway or that pathway from Zaporizhzhia. And that second pathway to the right here, they can flank them from behind, and that's going to be a real problem. And so immediately, Hulipole is something where the Ukrainians don't want to lose it. They understand that there's farm fields between it, but once the Russians cross that, they are flanking Orihiv, this barrier between the Russians and Zaporizhzhia, this massive Ukrainian city that has so far stayed out of the range of Russian artillery. The Russians want to get it in artillery range. And this would mean the just gains for the Russian army that would be terrible for not only the defense of the Zaporizhzhia region, but also the humanitarian situation would intensify. The amount of displaced people, the amount of people that would be put out of work, what it would mean for the farmers of the Zaporizhzhia region, what it would mean for the people who work in the city itself, both in support of the country's defense, but also in support of its economy. And so Ukrainians want to stop this. And if the Russians were to divert forces from Hulipole or something like that, it wouldn't make any sense. This is an area that the Russians have seen the most success in for the last 3-4 months. So I have no reason to believe that they're going to pull back from there. The same thing in the south of Zaporizhzhia, where they haven't seen as much success as they've seen on the Hulipole front, with defenses here much more dug in, and it being, of course, much closer to Zaporizhzhia, and the fighting here being quite brutal. They have seen some advances, limited advances, as they continue to try to press that axis. And so, in my mind, the Russians have not given up on the capture of Zaporizhzhia. And so, a lot of this negotiation over, will they, won't they, over Donetsk, is all happening in the side conversation of the Russians obviously positioning to try to take Zaporizhzhia. So, for all those reasons, the Russians are stretched out on other axes. Not to even talk about the fighting that's going on in Volchansk, and of course, the situation with Russian occupation forces still being in Sumy, and the Ukrainians very much wanting to push them out. With all that being said, while the Russians might be able to muster some force, for them to be able to muster any immediate force to get these guys out of Kupyansk without it ending similarly to the Russian breakthrough. I don't even want to call it a breakthrough, considering how it ended. The Russian penetration, I think, would be more accurate. In Dobrpila, I don't think they're going to be able to muster those troops. So this all is to say that the Russian claim by Gerasimov being the one out of Shoigu and the Wagner boss Prigozhin, the angel who fell from the sky and presumably hit the sides of the helicopter over and over and over and over when it crashed, which probably 100% coincidental. He was the one who survived in power through that big showdown as part of the Russian general staff. He says during a big meeting with Putin that 19 Ukrainian battalions were surrounded and eliminated in Kupyansk. Mind you, this is coming at the same time where I saw the Russians posting footage of a Russian soldier walking around saying, we're in Kupyansk, yada, yada, we have Kupyansk. And it was geolocated like 20 kilometers away behind Russian lines. Everything that I've seen put forward that is actually footage of Kupyansk from the Russians is old footage. That is months old from when they were either just getting into fighting the urban fight for Kupyansk that they were then trapped in, or was right before the recent encirclement. Nothing that can be, geolocated recently. So everything that I've seen has been delusion, or for anybody who doesn't want to accept what's happened with the Kupyansk counteroffensive, the localized counteroffensive, or it's just been, repeating the party line, repeating what you're supposed to say from the government. And everything that I've seen that has been realistic from the Russian side has only been from the OSCENT channels, which is not surprising. This has happened during previous disasters for the Russian army, including the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and of course the Kherson counteroffensive that led to the liberation of the only regional capital the Russians have captured since 2022. So I would say that right now, the Russian situation in Kupyansk, despite what you might have heard on social media, has not improved. The situation for those trapped in the situation, trapped in the city, continues to deteriorate, and those outside the city don't seemingly have a means to break them out of it in the immediate term. And the troops that they would need to redeploy in order to do so would require removing pressure from axes of advance that are more politically significant and have been more in the headlines, generally speaking, when it comes to, Pokrovsk and how it's been on the headline of every Western media. Like anytime I go and I talk to either it's somebody in the defense industry, or it's somebody in the, somebody who works as a diplomat, or somebody who works as this, and I'm talking to them about the situation in Ukraine, it's always about Pokrovsk. I don't get asked, what's the situation in Kupyansk? What's the situation in what's the situation in Sumy? I heard Lipsy is getting. I don't get asked that. I only get asked Pokrovsk. And that's not to say none of these things are of any importance. That's to say that right now the Russians want Pokrovsk for propaganda reasons. They want it for diplomatic reasons. And the Zaporizhzhia front line has had the most actual significant tactical and strategic advances for the Russians. Even though the capture of Hulepole has so far eluded them, its capture could lead to real strategic setbacks for the Ukrainian armed forces as they approach Orikhiv. These are axes of advance that are too important to them to redeploy troops from. So where are they going to get that manpower? Do they pull more from Sumy? Well, how do you pull more from Sumy without getting pushed out of the rest of Sumy? That's what they did in order to reinforce the Pokrovsk offensive to get to where they are now. If they pull out any more, what will that mean for the continued Russian occupation of Sumy? If the Ukrainians push them out of Sumy, they lose leverage that they can use to try to assert their claims over Donetsk at the negotiating table when going back and forth with the Russians, and it will make them look less sturdy to the Americans. On not negotiating with Russians, negotiating with Americans, of course, make them look less sturdy, like their military position isn't as significant, isn't as strong as the Russians are trying to imply. The same thing applies for Vovchansk. The same thing applies for Lipsy. The same thing applies for every single area where the Russians have crossed over the border. So I don't know where they can redeploy from. Kherson is the only location I could think of, honestly, because a Ukrainian counteroffensive over the river into Kherson right now seems so outside of my mind and probably outside of the conception of Russian military planners right now that that might be the one area they can pull from. But the Kherson occupation forces right now already sits at pretty low numbers compared to 2022 and 2023. The occupation of Kherson has the least Russian forces maintaining it since the start of the invasion. So yeah, they could pull more from there. And yes, the Ukrainians actually being able to conduct an offensive over the line when they're having manpower problems stationing their defensive positions might seem hard to believe. But there was also the Kupyansk counteroffensive, which the Russians seemingly did not expect. So would Russian command really want to play the game of, you know what, 5,000 men is enough to, just be just basically a police force. The Ukrainians wouldn't be so bold. I'm not saying that the Russians would not get to that position through taking slice after slice after slice to try to sustain the offensives by accident, but I don't think anybody's going to make that conscious decision. Even if there's no Ukrainian, there doesn't really be any pathway for Ukrainians to conduct that right now with the manpower that they have. That's what the information that we have and with the information that they have, and they won't want to play too many risks. So I just don't see where they get that manpower from. I just don't see where they get that manpower from outside of pulling from a totally new region or manpower pool entirely. So that's why I think whether or not they're able to get into Kupyansk again down the road, months down the line, right now, I don't think there's any hope for the Russians that are inside Kupyansk besides death or surrender.